Welcome to the Mystery and Horror Channel. Get ready for dark stories that will give you chills. Before we start, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay tuned for every new mystery. Now turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let's dive into terror. Story 1: The Voice in the Forest. When I was 17, my parents decided to rent an isolated house for us to spend the summer. It was in a rural area surrounded by a dense and mysterious forest. The house was simple but cozy, with large windows facing the woods and a porch that seemed perfect for enjoying the silence of nature. Little did we know that what awaited us there would forever change our perception of tranquility. On the first day, everything seemed normal. We spent time settling in, exploring the grounds, and walking along nearby trails. During the day, the forest seemed friendly, filled with birds and the sound of wind rustling the leaves. But when night fell, that same forest gained an oppressive atmosphere. The silence was so deep that every small noise stood out, creating a tension we couldn't explain. On the first night, as we sat on the porch stargazing, we heard something coming from the woods. It was a faint sound, almost indistinguishable, but it sounded like a voice. At first, we thought it was just the wind or some animal, but the sound kept repeating. It was like someone calling for help, distant and muffled. My dad told us not to worry, saying it was probably an echo of something natural. On the second night, the sound returned, but this time it was clearer. It was a woman's voice, and now we could distinguish words. She was saying help in a drawn-out, exhausted tone. My older brother, Daniel, became worried and convinced my dad to investigate. They grabbed flashlights and told my mom and me to lock the doors while they checked it out. The following minutes felt like an eternity. Each one passed like an hour, and my mom and I sat in silence, listening for any sounds from outside. The crunch of leaves underfoot faded into the distance until everything went deathly quiet. After about 15 minutes, we heard hurried footsteps returning. My dad and Daniel appeared at the door, pale-faced and wide-eyed. They told us to grab our things immediately. There was no explanation at the time, just a clear command: leave the house. Without understanding why, we obeyed, and within minutes we were in the car, leaving the house behind. My dad drove in silence, his knuckles white from gripping the wheel. Daniel sat quietly, staring into space. Hours later, when we stopped at a cheap hotel in the nearest town, Daniel finally spoke. He told us that as they walked along the trail, they came across a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a woman. She had long black hair and wore a white dress that looked old, almost like a burial shroud. But what terrified them was her face, or rather, the lack of one. Where her eyes and mouth should have been, there was only a dense shadow, like an absolute void. When she turned toward them, they heard the same plea for help, but her lips didn't move. My dad grabbed Daniel's arm, and they ran back to the house without looking back. Daniel said he felt like something was following them but didn't dare confirm it. Years later, still haunted by the experience, I researched the area and discovered that decades ago, a young woman disappeared in that forest. She was last seen asking for help on the nearby road, but no one stopped. Her body was never found. To this day, I wonder if the voice we heard was hers, trapped in that place, or something more sinister taking her form to lure victims. Story 2: The Presence in the Basement. A few years ago, my husband and I moved into an old house that seemed straight out of a fairy tale. It was an imposing structure, over 100 years old, full of charm and character. The facade was made of weathered red brick, the windows framed in dark wood, and there was a small front garden with wildflowers growing chaotically. When we first visited the house, I was immediately drawn to its historical aura. It seemed like the perfect refuge to start our new life together. However, within the first few days, I began noticing small things that unsettled me. The house had a large basement with stone walls and a musty smell, which we used to store boxes and old furniture. Every time I went down there, I felt an inexplicable discomfort. The air seemed denser, heavier, and there was always a faint sound, like something moving far away. My husband insisted it was just normal noises from an old house, but I knew it wasn't just that. One evening, while he was working late, I was home alone. I was watching TV in the living room when I heard a noise coming from the basement. It was a low sound, like the creak of a chair being dragged. My heart raced, but I tried convincing myself it was just the old wood settling. However, the sound continued, growing increasingly distinct. It sounded like something was moving down there. I grabbed a flashlight and descended the stairs slowly, each step echoing in the silence of the night. When I reached the basement, the sound abruptly stopped. I looked around and noticed something strange. A wooden chair was turned to face the wall in a dark corner. I didn't remember seeing it there before. As I got closer, I noticed marks on the dusty floor, as if the chair had been dragged recently. A wave of chills ran through me and I quickly left, locking the door behind me. I didn't tell my husband that night, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. In the following days, the sounds from the basement grew more frequent. I started hearing light footsteps, as if someone was pacing back and forth. Sometimes I woke in the middle of the night feeling like something was standing by the bed, watching me. Once I even felt a faint touch on my arm, but when I turned on the light, no one was there. My husband remained skeptical, insisting it was my imagination, but the tension in the house seemed to grow every day. The situation came to a head one early morning. We were asleep when a loud noise woke us. It sounded like something heavy had fallen in the basement. My husband, finally convinced something was wrong, agreed to go down with me to investigate. We grabbed a flashlight and carefully descended the stairs, each step echoing in the empty basement. When we reached the bottom, we saw something that froze our blood. The same wooden chair I had seen before was now turned toward the center of the basement. Sitting on it was a porcelain doll. It wore an old white dress that looked yellowed with age, and its glass eyes seemed to follow us. The most chilling part was that the doll hadn't been there before. It was impossible for anyone to have placed it there without us noticing. As we stood staring, we heard a sound I will never forget. A low, raspy laugh echoing off the stone walls. The laugh seemed to come from everywhere at once. Without a second thought, we ran up the stairs, locked the door, and grabbed only the essentials before leaving the house that very night. We didn't even return for the boxes we had stored in the basement. Later, we discovered that the house's former owner had been a reclusive woman who spent her final years in the basement. According to neighbors, she had a porcelain doll she treated as a daughter, and after her death, the basement had remained locked for decades. To this day, when I think of that doll and the laughter we heard, I feel chills run down my spine. I know something in that house was beyond our understanding, and I am grateful we left before anything worse happened. Story 3. The Mirror in the Bedroom. About 10 years ago, I rented an old apartment in a historic building downtown. It was small, with creaky wooden floors, high ceilings, and windows that let in the glow of the old streetlights outside. The place had a charming atmosphere, but there was something about it I couldn't quite define. Maybe it was the exaggerated silence or the way the hallway seemed longer at night. Even so, I was thrilled to have my own space. On my first day there, I noticed something peculiar. In the main bedroom, there was a large mirror fixed to the wall across from the bed. The mirror had a slightly antique look with a worn golden frame, as if it had belonged to another era. I didn't think much of it at the time and even found it added a vintage touch to the room. That first night, as I got comfortable in bed, I felt a slight unease. The mirror reflected the bed and the bedroom door, and even with the lights off, it seemed to catch strange shadows. At first, I thought I was just tired from moving in. I fell asleep quickly, but in the middle of the night, I was woken by a faint sound, like something lightly tapping the mirror's frame. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. One evening, as I brushed my teeth in the bathroom, I passed by the bedroom mirror and could have sworn I saw something move across its surface. It wasn't my reflection. I was alone, and it was outside my field of view. The image disappeared as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough to leave me unsettled. I started avoiding looking directly into the mirror, especially at night. One time, as I was getting into bed, I caught a shadow in the mirror from the corner of my eye. It seemed to be inside the mirror, like something, or someone, was standing behind the glass watching. I tried to ignore it, but the chill that ran down my spine was impossible to shake. On the fourth night, things escalated. I woke up suddenly with the overwhelming feeling that someone was in the room with me. The air felt heavy, and when I opened my eyes, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the mirror's reflection, a figure was standing in the corner of the room. It was tall, humanoid in shape, but it had no face. just a dense shadow where its features should have been. I turned my head quickly to look directly at the corner, but it was empty. When I glanced back at the mirror, the figure was still there, motionless, watching me. I panicked and left the bedroom. I spent the rest of the night on the living room couch with all the lights on. The next day, I asked a friend to help me remove the mirror. He joked that I was overreacting, but he agreed to help. As we removed the mirror, we discovered something that made me even more uneasy. On the back of the frame, faintly scratched into the wood, were strange words. They seemed to form a message or a prayer, but they were in a language I couldn't understand. I didn't want to know what they meant. We carried the mirror to the building's garage and left it there. I told the building manager he could keep it or throw it out, but I wanted nothing more to do with it. After the mirror was gone, everything returned to normal. Still, it took me a long time to sleep soundly without remembering the figure in the reflection. Months later, I ran into the building manager and asked about the mirror. He looked at me strangely and said it had vanished from the garage the same night I left it there. To this day, I wonder what I saw that night. Was it real or was my mind playing tricks on me? Deep down, though, I know the truth. Story 4. The Man on the Road. When I was a child, my family traveled a lot. My dad loved driving at night when the roads were quiet and the scenery had a unique charm under the moonlight. But one of those trips left a mark on me that I'll never forget. We were returning home after visiting my grandparents in the countryside. It was around 1 in the morning and the road was almost deserted. I was in the back seat, fighting sleep while my parents talked to stay awake. Everything was calm until we saw something by the side of the road. It was a man standing under a street light, staring intently at the car as we approached. He was tall and thin, wearing dark clothes that seemed too big for his frame. But his face was what terrified me the most. It looked deformed, as if partially melted. His eyes were sunken, almost like hollow sockets. My dad slowed down, thinking he might need help, but my mom stopped him, saying it was too dangerous. As we passed, the man slowly turned his head to follow the car with his gaze. Even as we sped up, I felt like he was looking directly at me. A few minutes later, the atmosphere in the car grew tense. My dad was quiet and my mom seemed uneasy. Suddenly, the radio turned on by itself, emitting only static. My dad tried to turn it off, but it wouldn't respond. At the same time, my brother, who had been sleeping next to me, woke up screaming. He said he had a nightmare about a strange man pulling him out of the car. My dad hit the gas, eager to get off that road as quickly as possible. But then I saw something that made me scream. The man was standing ahead of us by the roadside again, exactly as before. It was impossible for him to have gotten there so quickly. As we passed him for the second time, he turned his head again, but this time he smiled. When we finally got home, my parents didn't mention what had happened, but I could tell they were as shaken as I was. For weeks, I had nightmares about that man and his deformed smile. To this day, I avoid driving on rural roads at night, and I still wonder, who or what was that man? Story 5. The House at the End of the Street. I grew up in a quiet neighborhood filled with neatly kept lawns and tree-lined streets. But there was one house at the end of the street that no one dared to approach. It was an old, dilapidated building with broken windows, peeling paint, and a rusty gate that creaked even when there was no wind. The neighbors would tell stories about the house, claiming it was cursed. Back then, I thought it was just tales to scare kids. My opinion changed the day I decided to enter it. It was during a particularly hot summer, and my friends and I were bored. One of them suggested we explore the house. At first, everyone hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us. We met at sunset and carefully stepped through the gate. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and every step crunched against the dry leaves beneath our feet. Up close, the house looked even more ominous, with its empty windows staring at us like hollow eyes. We entered through the front door, which was ajar. The smell of mold and decay hit us immediately. The interior was dark, even with the sunlight still lingering outside. The floor creaked beneath our weight, and the walls were covered in scratches as if made by claws. One of my friends found a staircase leading to the upper floor, and despite our better judgment, we decided to go up. The second floor had a long hallway with doors on either side. One door was slightly open, revealing what seemed to be a child's bedroom. Inside, there were toys scattered on the floor, a rocking chair in the corner, and a large mirror propped against the wall. As we explored the room, we heard a sound from downstairs. It was faint like footsteps. We froze, our hearts racing, trying to convince ourselves it was just the wind. Then the sound came again, louder this time. We decided to head downstairs and leave the house, but as we passed the living room, we noticed something that made us stop in our tracks. The front door, which had been ajar when we entered, was now completely shut. One of my friends tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Meanwhile, the sound of footsteps continued, now coming from the hallway behind us. Panicked, we ran toward the kitchen, hoping to find another way out. As soon as we entered, the temperature dropped sharply. In the corner of the kitchen, we saw something that froze us in place. A dark figure crouched in the shadows, its form barely visible but undeniably human-like. It seemed to be watching us, even though it had no discernible eyes. The air grew heavy, and a wave of fear washed over us. Without thinking, we bolted toward a window and climbed out. We didn't stop running until we were far down the street. When we turned back, we saw the figure standing in one of the upstairs windows, watching us. None of us ever returned to that house. A few months later, it was demolished. But even now, when I walk past the empty lot, I feel as if something is still there, watching. Story 6. The Late Night Visitor. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. I've always sought logical explanations for things. But one night, something happened that defied all reason. It was an ordinary evening and I was home alone. My parents were out of town, and I decided to watch a movie before heading to bed. It was past midnight when I heard what sounded like a knock on the living room window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then the knocking came again, this time louder. My heart began to race. I stood up slowly and walked to the window. Outside, everything seemed normal, but there was something off. The garden was completely silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves. I locked the window and decided to go to my room. As I settled into bed, I heard the knock again. This time, it came from my bedroom window. A chill ran down my spine. My bedroom was on the second floor. There was no way anyone could be outside that window. I tried to ignore it, but the knocking persisted, steady and deliberate. Summoning all my courage, I approached the window. When I looked out, there was no one there, but a shadow moved quickly along the side of the house, too fast to be human. I climbed back into bed, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But then I heard footsteps downstairs. I grabbed my phone to call my parents, but the signal was weak. I tried dialing the police, but the call wouldn't go through. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The creak of my bedroom door slowly opening. There was no one there. The door stopped halfway open and silence filled the room. I couldn't move. After a few minutes, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. I spent the rest of the night under my covers, trembling with fear. When morning came, I cautiously checked the house. Everything was locked, as if no one had entered. To this day, I don't know what visited me that night, but I've never felt truly alone since. Story 7. The Locked Room. When I moved into my first apartment, I was enchanted by its charm. It was an older building with high ceilings, wooden floors, and ornate details that spoke of its early 20th century construction. But one detail left me uneasy: a locked door at the end of the hallway. The landlord explained it was a storage room that hadn't been used in years. The key was lost, so the room remained sealed. At first, I barely noticed the door. My days were busy unpacking and adjusting to my new space. But as the weeks went on, strange things began to happen. At night, I'd hear faint noises coming from the direction of the locked room, whispers, faint scratching, and occasional thuds. At first, I dismissed it as the creaking of an old building, but the sounds grew more persistent with each passing night. One evening, while watching TV in the living room, I heard a loud crash from the hallway. My heart raced as I realized it had come from the locked room. Gathering my courage, I approached the door and pressed my ear against it. At first, there was only silence, but then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound like breathing. Terrified, I rushed back to the living room and decided to ignore it. But the noises continued over the next few nights, escalating to soft knocks on the locked door. Each knock felt deliberate, like someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. Desperate for answers, I called the landlord to inquire more about the room. His tone became hesitant and he avoided my questions. "It's just a storage room," he insisted, though his voice betrayed unease. When I pressed him, he admitted that the previous tenant had requested the room be sealed but refused to explain why. Unable to suppress my curiosity, I decided to open the room. I bought a set of tools and spent an afternoon working on the rusted lock. It took hours, but eventually the lock gave way and the door creaked open. Inside, the air was heavy, carrying a stale, musty odor. The room was small and cluttered with old furniture draped in dusty sheets. In the center of the room was a single armchair facing the wall, and on the chair lay a leather-bound journal. I picked up the journal and began flipping through it. The entries started innocently enough, a tenant documenting their move and daily life. But as I read further, the tone darkened. The tenant described hearing whispers and feeling watched at night. They mentioned dreams of a tall, faceless figure calling to them from the locked room. The final entry simply read, "It's here now. I can't escape." A sudden chill ran through the room and I felt a presence behind me. The air grew colder and I was paralyzed with fear. I tried to turn, but my body wouldn't obey. Then right by my ear I heard a whisper. It wasn't a voice I could understand, but the malice in it was unmistakable. Dropping the journal, I bolted out of the apartment and didn't stop until I was outside. I never went back. I arranged to have my belongings moved out while I stayed with friends. Months later, I heard from a neighbor that the apartment had been left vacant since my departure. The landlord had reportedly tried to rent it out, but every new tenant left within weeks, citing strange occurrences. Whatever was in that room wasn't meant to be disturbed, and I'll never forget the cold, oppressive presence that still lingers in my nightmares. Story 8: The Ghost Train. During a trip to the countryside, I decided to visit a small town famous for its mysteries. Among the local legends, one caught my attention: the tale of a train that vanished decades ago, taking all its passengers with it, only to reappear at an abandoned station on certain nights. The station was tucked away in a desolate area, surrounded by overgrown vegetation and rusting tracks that disappeared into the horizon. I arrived late in the afternoon, and the atmosphere was already unsettling. The station building was in ruins, its walls covered in graffiti that seemed to stare back at me. The locals had been tight-lipped about the place, but one elderly man had warned me, never be there at midnight. Naturally, I decided midnight was the perfect time to visit. As the sun set, I waited on the decrepit platform. The silence was eerie, broken only by the occasional chirp of crickets. As the clock approached midnight, the air seemed to grow heavier. Then I heard it. First, it was faint, a distant whistle barely audible. I stared down the rusted tracks, my heart pounding. The sound grew louder, accompanied by a low rumble that shook the ground. Moments later, I saw it, a train emerging from the darkness. It was unlike anything I'd seen before, an old-fashioned steam locomotive, blackened by time with dimly glowing windows. The train slowed to a stop at the platform and the air grew still. I froze as the doors creaked open. Inside, I could see passengers seated in silence. But something was wrong. They weren't moving. Their faces were pale, and their eyes stared straight ahead, unblinking. I couldn't look away as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me, soft footsteps, impossibly close. When I turned, no one was there, but the feeling of being watched intensified. When I glanced back at the train, it was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of burning coal. I fled the station, my heart racing. The next morning, I shared what I'd experienced with a local historian. He nodded gravely and told me about the train that had disappeared over 50 years ago during a storm, leaving no survivors. The wreck was never found, but sightings of the ghost train continue to this day. Even now, the memory of that night haunts me. I can still hear the whistle in my dreams, and every time I see train tracks, I wonder if the ghost train is waiting, ready to carry its next passengers into oblivion. Story 9. The Scarecrow Man. When I was a child, my family lived on an isolated farm surrounded by fields that stretched endlessly. Despite the solitude, I loved it. I'd spend my days exploring the barn, running through the meadows, and watching the animals. But there was one part of the property I avoided, the field where the scarecrow stood. The scarecrow was ancient, its straw body stuffed into oversized, patched clothes. Its face was a burlap sack with crude eyes and a mouth stitched onto it. It had always been there long before my family moved in, and my parents said it was supposed to keep the crows away. But it didn't work. The crows ignored it completely. Whenever I passed near it, I felt its stitched eyes watching me. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I noticed something strange. The scarecrow, which always stood in the middle of the field, seemed closer to the fence. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light or my imagination, but unease settled in my chest. When I mentioned it to my mother, she brushed it off as the wind moving the pole it was mounted on. My father, however, said nothing, a shadow of worry crossing his face. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Groggy and confused, I climbed out of bed and peered out my bedroom window. In the moonlight, I saw a figure standing in the yard. It was the scarecrow. Its outline was unmistakable, the straw arms, the misshapen clothes, and that eerie burlap face. My blood ran cold. I slammed the window shut and hid under my blankets, trembling. The next morning, the scarecrow was back in its usual spot, motionless in the field. When I told my parents what I'd seen, my mother dismissed it as a bad dream. My father, however, seemed shaken. He told me to stay away from the scarecrow and didn't explain further. A few nights later, the sound of footsteps returned, louder this time, as if something heavy was pacing outside the house. My father grabbed his shotgun and stormed outside, shouting into the darkness. My mother and I waited inside, paralyzed with fear. He came back minutes later, pale and tight-lipped. "It's gone," was all he said. The next morning, my father removed the scarecrow from the field. He dragged it to a pile of dry branches and set it on fire. I watched the flames consume it, the burlap face curling and blackening. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of relief. But that night, as I lay in bed, I awoke to a chilling realization. I wasn't alone. In the corner of my room stood a shadowy figure, tall and motionless. I couldn't make out any details, but I felt its presence, heavy and oppressive. I closed my eyes tightly, too afraid to move. When I finally mustered the courage to look again, the figure was gone. After that night, we never spoke of the scarecrow again. My father kept the shotgun by his bedside, and my mother avoided the topic entirely. Sometimes, when the wind rustles through the fields, I think I hear footsteps. And though the scarecrow is gone, I can't shake the feeling that something still lingers watching. Story 10. The Doll in the Attic. When my grandmother passed away, I inherited her old house. It was a sprawling, creaky place filled with antique furniture and memories of her life. Among its many features, the attic stood out, a space I had never been allowed to enter as a child. My grandmother had always said it was unsafe, full of clutter and weak floorboards. But now that the house was mine, I decided to explore. The attic was dark and musty, with beams of sunlight piercing through cracks in the roof. Old furniture covered in sheets stood like ghostly figures, and cobwebs hung in every corner. As I rummaged through the clutter, I found something that made me pause, a porcelain doll. She had blue glass eyes, a delicate painted face, and a white lace dress that had yellowed with age. She sat on a small wooden chair, perfectly positioned to face the attic door. I carried the doll downstairs, thinking it would make a quaint decoration for the living room. That night, as I sat reading in the quiet house, I began to hear faint scratching sounds. They seemed to come from the direction of the doll. Dismissing it as the house settling, I ignored the noise and went to bed. But the sounds continued. Over the next few nights, I was awakened by faint laughter, high-pitched and childlike. Once, I awoke to find the doll facing a different direction than I had left it. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, but the unease grew stronger. One night, I decided to move the doll back to the attic. I placed her in the same chair and left, hoping that would put an end to the strange occurrences. But the next morning, she was back in the living room, sitting in the exact spot where I had first placed her. My stomach dropped. There was no one else in the house. I called my mother to ask if she knew anything about the doll. Her voice faltered before she admitted something chilling. My grandmother had always insisted that the doll belonged to the house and must never be removed from the attic. She refused to say more, but her tone made it clear she was frightened. That night, I heard footsteps creaking across the attic floor above me. The sound was deliberate, pacing back and forth. Gathering my courage, I climbed the stairs to confront whatever was up there. When I opened the attic door, the air was freezing. The doll was back in her chair, facing the doorway. Her glass eyes seemed to glint in the dim light, as if mocking me. I left the house that night and never returned. I hired movers to collect my belongings, but I left the doll exactly where I'd found her. Months later, I heard the new owners of the house had reported strange noises and asked about its history. I didn't tell them about the doll. Even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, certain I hear faint laughter. I haven't seen the doll again, but I can't shake the feeling that she's still watching, waiting. If you made it this far, the mystery has hooked you. So, leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to follow each new story. Thanks for watching and see you in the next terror.